Members of the South African Police Service and the South African National Defence Force embarked on their operation to recover suspected looted goods. There are growing concerns about the human rights violations of the suspected looters, with calls for a probe into the inhumane treatment of some looters in Gauteng and KwaZulu-Natal. To help me unpack this, I'm joined now by the Commission for Gender Equality Chairperson, Tamara Mathebula, and the Acting Executive Director at the Center for the Study of Violence and Reconciliation, Moyo-Kupeta, as well as criminologist with the University of Stellenbosch, Dr. Guy Lamb, to be a part of the conversation tonight. WhatsApp your questions and comments for our panel tonight on 072-110-5584. You can tweet us at Newzroom405. Good evening to you all, and thank you very much for your time tonight on In Focus. All right, I hope you can hear me there. Good evening, team, and hope you are well this evening. Let me start with you, Chairperson, Mama Tamara. What inspired this call for a probe into the treatment of suspected looters?
Yes, good evening to you and good evening to your viewers out there. Thank you very much for having me. What we looked at was that before releasing the statement was based on the unrest that broke out, in two provinces. We know that, from the week of the 13th, this is where things started in the country. But basically, we've been following up quite a lot of media reports. We've been following up on what social media is saying. We've been listening to people. We've been having and receiving some of the complaints of people whose rights have been violated. And basically, I think specifically on this one, it was picked up in the social media that somewhere in the northern parts of Pretoria, in a particular mall, a lot of people's rights were violated on that particular day, with a lot of women, men who were caught actually looting, were subjected to some kind of inhumane way of punishing them for having been caught red-handed with some of the goods that they took from the shops. And we looked at this, and we looked at how we normally deal with certain crimes, and the dealing of these certain crimes by certain sections of our communities is not right. It's actually violating people's rights, whose rights are actually protected in the Bill of Rights, which is Chapter 2 of the Constitution of South Africa. And we know that the Constitution and the Bill of Rights is quite clear that all of us, we are supposed to be protected, and the Bill of Rights is actually clear that you cannot, we need to promote, and you cannot disrespect anyone's rights, whether that person is a person who has committed a crime, and or whether that person is even a prisoner. We know that even prisoners do have rights. Yeah. It's just that their rights are actually limited. So out of this excitement, we saw that people were punished in different ways that were quite inhumane.
Do you classify the kind of looting that we saw break out the last couple of days as criminal looting and as looting that undermines the rule of law? And certainly what we have seen, it certainly destroys the economy of the country. And therefore, what are the consequences in your view that should accompany that level of looting?
Yes, look, the economy of this country, due to the looting and the crimes that were committed, including not only just looting, but the burning down of the buildings and burning down of the shops, and certain basic things like the clinics and all of those things. Those kind of crimes have actually brought the country's economy to its knees. And for me, and I think for any other person, no one actually condones the fact that those were serious crimes, and they needed some kind of serious intervention by the officials, of course, and government. But look, it doesn't actually mean that you need to dehumanize people. And in my view, I would say that people need to be given a punishment, and that punishment needs to be equal to the kind of crime that a person has actually perpetrated, and not to expose a person to such inhumane kind of taking the dignity away of a particular person, just because that person has been caught taking food or taking, a packet of biscuits from the shelves, and then that person will actually be made to frog march in front of the people naked and things like that. Yeah. And I'm not saying that's what happened.
Dr. Galamb, give me your analysis of looting laws in the country. Do we have such? Do they exist? And how are they actually implemented?
Well, I'm not a specialist on looting laws. Kind of the work that I've done has looked at why looting takes place. But essentially, I mean, looting is a type of theft. I mean, it's a kind of collective theft that's happening, but it's individuals who are participating in theft. So, of course, we have the Criminal Procedure Act. We have various other forms of legislation that relate to this. So this is, in terms of what looting is, it's ultimately theft or robbery. In this case of looting did take place where there were weapons involved. So, I mean, we do have the laws to deal with it. I think the kind of key question here is largely in relation to how the police have conducted themselves. So, and, what we've seen in some of the incidences in responding to looting, but also after the looting, when police went to a number of people's, private property and, kind of raided the properties under suspicion that there were stolen goods or looted goods there, they behaved in particular ways. And I think a kind of point ready to make here is this is not the first time this has happened. Also during the looting, for example, the incidences of dehumanizing types of instructions and forcing people to do humiliating things. As we saw this last year during the enforcement of the lockdown level 5, level 4 regulations, where people were forced to do sort of physical types of exercises that were quite humiliating as well. We've seen this happen during sort of saturation, high density operations. So there is a particular problem here with police culture, particularly when it comes to these kind of interventions. And we shouldn't be in a position where, police are actually contributing to violation of people's rights. We should be looking at ways in which the police are looking to kind of build legitimacy amongst populations. Yeah. So let me not comment. So there's no specific looting laws to the best of my knowledge, but certainly we have sufficient legislation to deal with theft and robbery.
There are proud looters, or at least those who've declared themselves proud looters. Even in their acts, some have taken selfies, devouring cake. Others have posted all sorts of videos on social media about their loot. How should society respond to those who are declaring themselves proud looters?
Of course, this is a norm issue. I mean, what we saw certainly during the looting is sort of a temporary sort of change in norms where people normally wouldn't have engaged in looting, engaged in this sort of type of behavior. But so many people in specific areas did it, and it was seen as something to, sort of, it has sort of a status aspect to it, that you really want to sort of show and demonstrate what you've done as a way to kind of get some sort of notoriety maybe. But in these kind of circumstances, I think it's about, if we really want to try and, as a society, prevent these sort of things from happening, it's about sort of making statements that this is unacceptable and constantly demonstrating that, because I think that's where there was kind of a problem during the looting. There weren't any sort of countervailing forces in the areas where the looting happening to say that this looting is unacceptable. We saw looting getting stopped in certain areas where residents and community members sort of stood up and protected shopping malls, and you had sort of community organizations out on the street and community leaderships really indicating that this is unacceptable, and they were able to kind of prevent looting from continuing. And I think it's quite important in the social media space for other voices to come through and condemn this and kind of really hold those individuals to account and almost shame them.
Anna, good evening. Good to have you with us as well. Did the looters display any form of human dignity in their actions, and how should society respond?
Good evening, Thabo. So the right to human dignity, as other speakers have said, Tamara, for instance, has said it. So when we saw people being frog-marched, for instance, when we saw people being humiliated in public, their right to human dignity in terms of Section 10 of the South African Constitution was violated. And for those who were killed, for instance, during the mayhem, the right to life was taken away. So for looters, for instance, those who were paraded on television, who were being shown, who were being shamed, so their right to dignity may have been violated in the process. But also we, as you have said earlier, Thabo, we saw also some of the proud looters, so to speak, in courts, coming out showing some of the loot, or some of them really taking luxury items, looting luxury items, as opposed to the bread and butter goods like foodstuffs and things that most of the people who were looting, for instance, took, because for them it was the desperation of hunger. They wanted to feed their children. They wanted to put food on the table. And suddenly the mayhem made that possible when many shops were left unattended, when they were vandalized and so forth. And some of the very things that they needed were in their reach. So the right to dignity really came into question, especially for those who were paraded. But at the same time, even seeing these images on television where people can identify you, and now with social media, these are images that will probably be available online publicly for a long time. So even at a later stage, these are fathers, these are mothers. So even the right to human dignity going forward, where when someone is met on the street, it's easy to identify, to say this is the person who was carrying the TV on that day. This is the person who looted a ShopRite that day. This is the person who took a bag of Millimil and was had that bag taken away by the police. So some of those images really do violate the right to human dignity of the looters, those who have been identified and have been caught on media, having their things taken back, or even being frog-marched by the police going forward. So the right to human dignity, as you say, Thabo, has been violated at a number of levels.
Tamara Mathebula, Moyo-Kupeta, as well as Dr. Guy Lamb stays with us, and you, of course, on Twitter at Newzroom405, on WhatsApp 072-110-5584. We want to interrogate this question on criminal looting and whether or not those who are calling for a probe into the inhumane treatment of suspected looters are trying to create a legitimate, I suppose, defense for the criminal act, and will this in turn condone this behavior in society? Let's get your views tonight as we continue on In Focus. Welcome back in conversation tonight with Tamara Mathebula and Moyo-Kupeta, as well as Dr. Guy Lamb. Criminal looting is the subject, as calls are being made for a probe into the inhumane treatment of the suspected looters. This as the South African Police Service and the National Defence Force are embarking on a campaign, Keep His Receipt. That's what the Minister of Police actually called this one. Now, Mama Mathebula, there are varying views, right, as to how we should approach this. There are some who are saying, for example, that holding looters accountable is something that we should do irrespective of the items that were taken or the circumstances that are surrounding their looting. And there are some in community, in society, who are saying, well, let's be more sympathetic and recognize the extreme need that led to this looting. Where do you sit on this?
Thank you very much for the question. Yes, I think those views have been shared with quite a number of us in terms of, whether we are government or whether we are, Chapter 9 institutions or civil society organizations, because I think the view of the society out there is that, look, the majority of the looters were people who were hungry, the people who were frustrated, the people who are unemployed, people who come from, poverty stricken areas who actually went into loot. So at least, the punishment should actually be looked at, and the circumstances, should be viewed in that way. I think, look, basically we are saying that, the general view is that, no matter what the circumstances, looting and stealing is not the right thing, or is not the right way of addressing our own frustrations or addressing our own circumstances as the society. So I think holding, looters to account, and making sure that not only holding looters into account, but also making sure that there is some kind of sensitization, some kind of education, some kind of, sharing and raising awareness of the general public, in terms of saying that when the circumstances, when these events when we are met with such events, or confronted with such events, how do we behave as a community? Because I will make an example. The very shops that we have burned in Alexandra, in KwaZulu-Natal, look at what has happened in Phoenix. Those are some of the things that we would, at the end of the day, need to make sure that we are able to access those basic goods that we need to make sure that we survive as people. So people need to be educated around how do you actually express your frustration without destroying what you would need in future and or tomorrow, if I can put it that way.
Yeah. Dr. Guy, in law there is a defense of necessity, right? Something that is available in criminal law. Do you have a defense of necessity when it comes to criminal looting?
I'm afraid I can't answer that question. I'm not an expert in that particular area. And I think that would ultimately be up to courts to determine on a case-by-case basis, because when we've had the case of looting, where we have seen desperately poor people who've engaged in looting, but I mean, the circumstances would ultimately have to be determined by a court.
Yeah, and as far as deterring this behavior, so that we do not say in society this kind of behavior is allowed, how far should the law go in punishing those who are indeed found guilty of having done such a crime?
Well, I think the point here is that, the state needs to demonstrate that the law can run its course and that everyone is equal before the law. I think the kind of question that's really emanating from this is that the looting was so extensive in certain areas that only some will fall foul of the law and others won't. The extent of evidence against many is just not there. So I think it's really up to the state to try and demonstrate that some will be held to account for this. But I think ultimately it's about conversations being had with communities that are being affected and trying to kind of have these conversations about, well, this is not in the interests of our community, the interests of our area in which we live in the interests of South Africa for this sort of behavior to continue, because it has so many negative effects. But yes, it is quite a complicated state of affairs that, there's no easy answers to addressing this just because it was so extensive.
Yeah. But then if you look, for example, at the thinking, right, of some of the looters and how they were behaving. In fact, I had a conversation in the beginning of the year, in the beginning of the week, I beg your pardon, with the South African Council of Churches. And they were saying that, for example, there's a young boy who went to a clothing shop, right, and actually stole a pair of shoes, something that he really quite needed, or underwear or something of that nature. Should that child now be criminalized?
Well, in the case of a child, that they wouldn't necessarily be criminalized because we have various legislation pertaining to children. I think in these kind of circumstances, it's around, as I say, these kind of cases, ultimately need to be determined by the courts, because in those kind of circumstances, it's around, well, you have people who are stealing sofas and TVs, by the truckload, and then you have these individuals who kind of engage in theft out of desperation. So it becomes a very difficult decisions to make on the part of the courts, but ultimately the courts will only be making decisions on a small number of cases. So it's very difficult to make make clear cases in this regard.
Yeah, but would we be sending the wrong message to that young individual? I mean, if we give this silent forgiveness to say, oh, well, we'll let it go past.
Well, I think it's not necessarily about silent forgiveness. I think one needs to be pursuing other mechanisms here, not necessarily a criminal justice mechanism, the sort of restorative justice type of approaches, kind of the sort of alternative kind of systems that can bring about justice that don't have to follow the line of a conviction and jailing people, where if those who've perpetrated certain forms of looting can, in a way, pay back to society without getting a criminal record. I think we need to be looking at those kind of circumstances given the extent of the looting, and given that in some cases people did loot out of desperation or were desperate and took the opportunity to loot. So I think it's about exploring other opportunities and other options that are there, not just jailing people and giving people a criminal record.
Right. And Anna, this, of course, has given rise to the choice of two evils. It was rather people were going to say, well, they were looting, we were going to stay and be hungry, or we were going to participate and at least get something at this particular time of the pandemic with the economy the way that it is, and therefore left people with very limited choices.
Indeed, Thabo. So even when you look at what has happened, there are different layers to the issues. For instance, the issue started differently. There was a specific issue that was being addressed by those who took to the streets initially. But for those who were really hungry, when we speak of the masses who've been affected by COVID-19, who have lost their jobs, have lost employment, for instance, who have not fed their children for a number of days, the situation, the mayhem presented opportunities for that. So even when we now work on addressing this issue and rebuilding after the mayhem, after the violence, I think it's important, as Dr. Guy and also Tamara have said before, that even the justice that is meted out, for instance, really considers the different dimensions and the different layers that unfolded during this crisis. For instance, I mean, in my view, we really need to look at different dimensions of justice. Retributive justice, definitely, to punish some of the criminality, because we do have a penal code. But when you look at our justice system or the criminal justice system, even before punishment stage, you do present mitigation and aggravating circumstances to be presented before a judge, for instance, comes to a decision on what punishment should be given or what sentence should be given, for instance. So our criminal justice system is really coupled with mercy. So there is a need to open up those spaces. So restorative justice, definitely. And we are happy that the president has started looking at some of the dimensions of the high levels of structural inequality and the impacts of COVID-19 by introducing again the distress relief grant that is going to be given even now to the care workers as well. So that is part of the restorative justice, but also at the same time looking at what those small businesses who have suffered the most, who may not be able to reopen after they've been looted, just to extend a lifeline for them in order to be operative, in order for them to operate and at least be viable. But also very importantly, let's address some of the structural issues through transformative justice dimensions, where, for instance, we try and deal with some of the structural issues that really have caused people to loot in the first place. So your issues of poverty, issues of unemployment, how do we address those? So there is a need for developmental justice and transformative justice, where citizens are moved from marginalization and existing on the margins or the periphery of society and economic activity to being brought to a space where they are also able to participate in the economic activity of the country as active citizens, holding the state accountable. There is also a need to even deal with transformation in itself. So we need to hold a number of conversations at different levels to make these different dimensions of justice to really take their course in order to address the multi-layered issues that have come to the fore as a result of the violence that we saw unfolding in the past 2 weeks or so.
All right, the next layer, and I want all of you to give me your comments on this, is that pain or harm has been inflicted by the breaking of the laws in this particular instance, and could that harm have been avoided, and how would it have been avoided? We'll get to that in a moment when we come back. See some of your reaction tonight to the conversation on the criminal looting and whether the looters forfeit their rights because of their acts of criminality and the harm inflicted in them breaking the law, or they should still be protected, I suppose, and be treated humanely. I suppose in our constitution in South Africa it goes without question that is a fundamental right of everyone, even those who commit crime, to be treated humanely. And these, as calls are being made by some in certain sectors, that a probe should be conducted invested into the treatment of suspected looters. But Dr. Galam, let's talk then about that very same question, that harm has been inflicted because of the breaking of the law. However, there are certain actions and activities that took place prior to the law being broken, during the time the law was being broken. We are talking now after, as the police are trying to correct the situation. Could the harm have been avoided?
Are you referring to the harm by the police, or are you referring to the harm caused by the looters?
The harm caused by the looters.
I mean, could it have been avoided? Well, potentially, and maybe not entirely. I mean, what we did see in parts of KZN and in parts of Gauteng was how quickly the looting spread. So clearly there were some systems in place and networks in place that encouraged it. But it also really spoke to what a number of the other panelists have spoken about, the sort of desperation that many South Africans are in. But I think what it also spoke to was the breakdown in relations between many communities and police. Because if there had been solid relationships in some places where there had been encouragement to loot, that, there would have been community voices and community organizations which would have come to the police and said, well, is there something, let's try and do something about it. We know who the particular individuals are who are encouraging it. Let's go and see if we can prevent looting from happening. But I think in many of the communities where the looting happened, is the relationships had broken down. So the police were on the back foot, it was very difficult for them to try and prevent this, because they didn't have the knowledge, they didn't have the relationship, they didn't have the intelligence, they didn't have community groups to work with to try and prevent this from happening. So, it potentially could have been solved in some places, potentially could have been kind of reduced. Of course, there was some very orchestrated forms of looting, and then namely attacking and targeting specific malls. If one had had better crime intelligence, then, maybe the police could have been deployed to those specific malls to prevent the harm from happening. But it really comes down to many of the communities where this happened, looting, it was sort of rife. It was a very high risk that looting could take place, and it was really just the sort of spark was established, and it kind of then led to the kind of wildfire of looting. So potentially some of the looting could have been stopped, but it was only if the police and the rest of the government authorities had the forewarning for this and their kind of personnel to actually prevent it.
Yeah. Tamara, do you believe that potentially this illegality or this illegal act could have necessarily been avoided?
Thank you very much, Thabo. I fully agree with Dr. Gailem in terms of saying, I think, it inherently could have been avoided in some other spaces. But look, I think in his own opening remarks, he did indicate that in the country we don't have what we call the looting, policy or guidelines or anything like that. I think we are a learning country, and we need to learn that, having been caught, unprepared like this, we need to be more prepared in future. Things like those policy guidelines need to be developed where there are no guidelines, so that everyone is actually aware and can know exactly when such things erupt, how do we deal with this, what are the guidelines and what are the guidelines saying. Secondly, I think there is an admittance by the president in his speech saying that, there was a delayed response at national level. I think we could have done better. And I know that I think we have seen in many parts of the country and of the few townships and other areas where I think we had very few police, South African police services that was deployed in those areas, and only after some time we realized, I think when there was realization that actually the situation was quite intense, there was a deployment of the SANDF. That could have been avoided if the deployment was done in time without any further delay, and I think that was only done after a lot of destruction has actually taken place. Last but not least, I think the communities also woke to the fact that, we cannot allow community members to do the looting anymore. We will actually defend, and I think that is quite commendable. We have actually seen some of the malls being saved from being looted and burnt down because the family and community members stood up and said, not in our name. So I think this, moving forward, I think there's quite a lot of lessons that we should actually take from what has happened, and I think we should be actually more prepared. We shouldn't be reactive, but we should be proactive moving forward.
I want to come back to that last part that you raised, but I've got another question, but I'll put that for you in a moment. But let's just deal with that last part that you're raising of communities having responded. We saw violence also coming out in the response from the communities, and there are some who are saying even greater human rights violations occurred there. But not only that, even criminal acts were conducted there with people actually being murdered. What's your reaction?
Yes, most definitely. I strongly believe that there should be some kind of dialogues that we begin to have now. In communities, in various institutions, and these dialogues should actually be some kind of a reflection of what has happened and how we have individually and collectively responded. Whether we responded in an inhumane manner or whether we responded in a manner that was actually trying to save. But look, these dialogues will actually assist. I think we have started doing our own dialogues, and if I can mention very quickly, as Chapter 9 institution, the South African Human Rights Commission held a dialogue on Friday to actually say, we have had this unrest, and what do we do moving forward as Chapter 9 institutions that are actually given the mandate and the responsibility to make sure that we uphold the constitutional democracy in the country. So I think those dialogues should actually cascade and go to various institutions and go to various decision-making bodies and go to communities themselves, because I think the reaction was not a much coordinated one, and it came in different pieces and sizes as we all tried to do our best.
Yeah. Now, Anna, the inherent difficulty in the question that I'm asking is of course, the fact that there are some who believe, yes, the police could have acted better, the intelligence in the country, the security cluster could have acted better to avoid this situation. But there are some who are also saying even the looters themselves could have chosen a better response to raise their grievances. But there are some who are anticipating, right, to say, actually, if things continue the way that they are continuing in the country, in the economy of this country, far worse situations could still erupt. Could the situation have been avoided?
Thank you, Thabo. That's really a difficult question to answer, and I will really look at all the angles in trying to answer it. Had we had early warning systems, for instance, as a country, we would have probably minimized the kind of hemorrhaging economically that we experienced over the past few weeks. So this speaks to the absence of early warning systems and the disconnect in communication and communicating some of the messaging that comes either through social media and other platforms, for instance, when people are mobilizing or communicating. I think as a country, Thabo, we have experienced a number of protests, and we have learned from the previous protests that protests usually end up in vandalism of property, in destruction of property, and in looting. If you just look in the past 2-3 or so years, in 2019, some of our very own service delivery protests end up in looting. Some of the xenophobic attacks, for instance, ended up in looting. So we ought to have had at least a head start in terms of preparing for such events, just from reflecting and learning from some of the occurrences in the past and how violent protests usually escalate into full-blown violence and destruction of property and looting. So that on its own should have alerted us to the fact that mayhem was following and massive looting was going to be the result. the end result of the protest. So that's one. And I've spoken as well about the absence of early warning systems. But also at the very same time, the delayed response that Tamara spoke about from the police also adds into the very answer to say that had the police acted, for instance, immediately, probably we would have seen some of the instigators being arrested, and that would have deflated, for instance, the level of looting that would have followed, or other follow-up violent activities that escalated so quickly. So early response from the police would have also resulted in minimizing the large-scale looting that we saw happening. So there is that. But at the same time, Thabo, this could have been probably minimized as well if people, when they try and air their grievances using more peaceful ways, when they are heard, especially issues around unemployment, issues around service delivery, issues around inequality, issues around, for instance, some of the corruption that people have seen. So all these socioeconomic challenges that people are facing, if those are addressed in time, for instance, it will also minimize some of the frustrations and the anger that many of the people who join these protests have and try to address through some of the violent ways of engaging. In some of our researchers, the Center for the Study of Violence and Reconciliation, we have spoken a lot about some of our findings around the fact that usually when people turn violent during protests, they would have tried more peaceful ways of engaging, but when leaders are not present to hear them, or when leadership does not take those grievances into consideration and address them, then people then tend to use more violent ways. In one of our reports, for instance, the Smoke That Calls report, we highlighted that some of the interviewees during the research indicated that the violence, the destruction of property becomes the smoke that calls leadership and the whole nation to come and see and hear finally what the grievances are, the very issues that people would have been trying to raise through peaceful ways. So finally people get heard when there is burning of tires, when there is mayhem, when there is looting. Yeah. So finally, this is when we see leaders come to the forefront, trying to address the people, telling the people, calling for calm. So again, the smoke that calls becomes the violence. But also, we should turn it around to say that had people been heard about these issues, for instance, and if these issues had been addressed, then the kind of mobilizing and galvanizing of people around violence and the looting may have been minimized.
All right, when we come back in a moment, I want to hear from our panel. Does the behavior we've seen in the couple of weeks represent a change in social norms in any way? And what is it that we need to do, seeing that, of course, the normative social attitudes or even behaviors failed to dominate the psyche of the South Africans during that time. Tamara Mathebula and Moyo-Kupeta, as well as Dr. Guy Lamb, stay with me. And of course, we'll take your questions tonight here on In Focus. We're back in a moment. Welcome back. You're live with us here tonight on In Focus. Newzroom Afrika, channel 405. Criminal looting under discussion tonight. We'll get to the WhatsApp messages and some of your tweets and what you have been asking on Facebook tonight. But before we get to those, let me go back to you, Anna, because you already touched a little bit on this, right? There are normative social values that generally dominate in society, right? We all agree that this is how we're going to behave. And what we saw the past couple of weeks is not how we have agreed we will behave in society. Does this represent a change in attitudes in the context of South Africa? And have we flipped the scale onto the other side and we will never be able to go back?
Thank you, Thabo. Not necessarily. I think what we have seen probably is a culmination of a number of frustrations, multi-layered issues, for instance, in the lives of people. I mean, you add COVID-19, the impacts of COVID-19, and some of the serious socioeconomic impacts that the pandemic has had on people. You add also the very structural issues of inequality, socioeconomic challenges that we face in South Africa, even under normal circumstances without the pandemic. You also add into that some of the issues that I raised, where people are trying to reach out to those in power, to leadership, and leadership is not doing much or is not hearing them when they engage more peaceful ways of engaging. And when you add also into that some of the unresolved issues of our past, when you look at the preamble in our constitution, it speaks about correcting some of the injustices of the past. And we are 27 years into democracy in South Africa, and some of the inequalities still persist, still continue, and are systemic and have gotten worse, for instance, and some of the issues actually have been carried on to the next generation. So you are seeing a lot of issues, multi-layered issues, presenting themselves and culminating into what we saw, the anger, the frustration, and some of the very behaviors that under normal circumstances we would not, for instance, we would not, in ways that would not behave under normal circumstances. So when you add all of these stressors, all of these issues, the multi-layered issues together, they really begin to shift and change how we would behave, for instance, because the very desperation that we spoke about earlier creeps into the fore, and it determines how we behave. It changes how, for instance, we would respond to issues. So all these things become triggers into that could easily escalate issues to the point of violence, the scale at which we saw violence manifesting over the past few weeks. So it's a number of issues, Thabo. Can we go back? For instance, yes, indeed, we can go back, but it will really require a lot of work in terms of us working on some of the multi-layered issues that have presented themselves, that have been at play in shifting and shaping our response to the issues, our response, for instance, and the easy way, how easily it has been to mobilize and galvanize people around the very same issues. Some of the fault lines around some of our democracy and just our understanding and responsiveness to what is right and what is wrong needs to be addressed through having those dialogues. People's reception and response to right and wrong has not shifted, but we have seen all these other additional stressors, all these other additional layered issues really shaping how people have responded. So definitely we can go back, but at the same time, our going back will require that we have the dialogues, we have the discussions, we begin to address some of the issues that have brought us to where we are currently.
Right. Guy, they normally say that the prevalence of a norm is not necessarily a strength. So talking of right and wrong, it's easier in society when, you know, there's one bad apple, you're a criminal. Of course, it's not a norm in society, so it's not acceptable, and you can correct that. But when you see a group of people behaving in a particular way, have we flipped the switch? Are we able to go back to the normative social values that we all accept? This is how we should behave?
I mean, we're looking specifically at looting, and looting is this kind of a very interesting phenomenon, because you'll have people who are law-abiding citizens in, you know, pretty much every aspect of their life, but there comes a moment where they are surrounded by other people who engage in looting, and they participate in looting and get caught up in the moments and become part of, you know, buy into the social norms and group norms that those other people are pursuing. So it's about the kind of space and time. I mean, if we use an example of, for example, a truck full of beer breaks down on the side of the road outside you know, a poorer community. It doesn't have to be a poorer community. Sometimes in, you know, kind of wealthy communities, the same thing happens, and groups of people will go and loot that truck. You know, some people will start and other people will join in, and momentum builds and the beer gets stolen. So, I mean, this is what it's been happening within South Africa, you know, sort of an ad hoc basis, largely within poorer communities, and often it's about theft and looting of food. Sometimes it's about other items as well. In relation, it's been mentioned by other panelists about xenophobia, for example, often in service delivery protests, anti-corruption protests in specific places. I think the kind of point here is what was very worrying in the past few weeks is how much of the looting had been encouraged and stimulated, because it tends to happen previously, certainly since the mid-1994. In very specific places that didn't spread beyond that. Here we saw it spread to so many different areas because it was being instigated and encouraged in other areas. So it's my concern going forward is is that it's been demonstrated that it can be used as quite an effective strategy by those who want to disrupt, create unrest, to protest. And I think this is around using, creating these opportunities for looting to happen. And it's something we really need to watch going forward. But certainly, I think nothing much has changed in South Africa. I think those who engaged in looting realized it wasn't right. And the kind of conversations that have been happening, there's been justifications around, I did it because I was poor. I did it because I was hungry. I did it because I desperately wanted a television set and didn't have it before. So the comments I've never heard saying, well, it's actually right to loot. I've been hearing conversations say it was wrong, but I did it for these reasons. So it's justified in a way. So I don't think the right and wrong has shifted, but I still think it's certainly brought, very much the focus around the desperation and the kind of poverty and unemployment that's just been exacerbated, certainly since the beginning of last year.
Well, we seem to have lost Tamara there on the line, but we'll stay with you. Let's go to WhatsApp and as well as Twitter and Facebook tonight to see some of your questions. On WhatsApp, Anonymous saying those people looting violated their own rights as well as those of law-abiding citizens. Poverty doesn't give anyone the right to break the law. T from Johannesburg CBD say, I honestly feel that we should not be too concerned about the rights of people caught on tape because one of those people were committing a crime. Secondly, raiding people's homes to find looted goods is not a violation of human rights in my opinion because the police are just doing their job to try and retrieve stolen goods. Tando in Tembisa saying, I agree with all the speakers. There are violations of human rights. It must stop immediately. A probe will take too long. All right, Temba saying, I agree that the looters should be held accountable for what they did. I just don't like the way that the SAPS and the soldiers are doing it. I mean, how can they search people's houses without a search warrant? And what about the rights of the owners that have been infringed? That is about being varying views there tonight from our viewers. Dr. Guy, I mean, the first one saying, well, they are looters, they're criminals, and therefore they forfeited their rights when they did that. But also another one saying, well, what about the rights of the poor shop owners that they violated?
Well, it's one of these issues here. It's around you don't sacrifice your rights because you allegedly committed a crime. I think in these kind of circumstances, it's about, justice does need to take its course. But of course, when it comes to these sort of circumstances, you've had so many rights violations that we have to try and find some sort of solution to this. And of course, it's really kind of extremely serious and really worrying what's happened to many small businesses within South Africa, not only being hit by lockdown regulations and COVID and restricted travel, but now being hit by looting. It's created very desperate situations for many small business owners around, and my heart really goes out to them. But of course, this conversation about rights is that we do have rights that are guaranteed in the Bill of Rights within the South African Constitution, and those need to be respected by government authorities and by other citizens as well.
Anna?
Thank you, Thabo. Indeed, there has been rights that have been violated, but at the same time, we cannot deal with this issue, for instance, using the criminal justice system alone. When we do that, then we are going to continue to see looting continue in South Africa. We have to address some of the root causes. So there has to be an investment in understanding why we are where we are. There has to be an investment in addressing some of the underlying issues that have brought us to where we are currently in South Africa. So we really need to look at this issue from a multi-pronged or from a multidimensional perspective. So we need to address the root causes, but we also need to deal with the criminality and ensure that it doesn't happen again. We need to have the dialogues in communities. We need to start programs that are aimed at rebuilding or restoring the social fabric in our communities and in society. We need to deal with issues of social cohesion because all of these issues, the fractures in our democracy, in our reconciliation have come to the fore. So really, what we have gone through as a nation presents a number of opportunities for us to begin to have some of those difficult conversations, to begin to address this issue from a number of levels, using a multidimensional approach to addressing the issues. Definitely, we need to invest a lot of time, to invest resources in addressing these issues, as multidimensional as they are, in order for us to really root out and address the much larger issue of violence and its normalization in our society before looting becomes the way of doing things and it becomes another pandemic that we have to deal with going forward.
I appreciate your time both, and thank you very much for joining us tonight. Dr. Guy Lamb and Moyo-Kupeta. Unfortunately, Tamara, they lost on the line, but thank you very much, Tamara Mathebula, also coming through tonight.